Hello, and welcome to another episode here on the channel of False Confidence. This is an episode dedicated to really looking at the contrast between what the world offers and what God offers through his word and through his character and his promises to his people. And this podcast was inspired by a realization that so much of my life and my mistakes and my own earthly desires, in contrast to what God is doing in my life, are things that I must share because other people, especially young people, are up against these same battles that I have faced and am facing and will face. And so this was inspired through really making sure that all of me is being used and useful for the Lord, and that there's nothing that I am leaving on the table. And that includes the stories of my mistakes, the stories of the struggles that I have put myself through, and the ways in which God has taught me. So that is the space. And we are doing just that today. One of the things that I wanted to share was the pitfalls that I see for us as young people as we start to say, okay, God, use me. I'm going after big things. I'm going after big adventures. I'm up to big things for the Lord. When we have that bigger mission, bigger vision sort of perspective, there's some sneaky little pitfalls that sneak in alongside our desires for the Lord and to glorify him. And I wanted to share some stories of what that looked like early on in my entrepreneurial adventure, in my adventure as a young adult, what some of those things looked like, because they may look very familiar to you. They may be familiar to your past. They may be familiar to your present. Or they may be things that you, because you listen to this, you now can see them in a way for what is coming, that may give you some discernment and wisdom that you may not have had previously. So that's my prayer, is that in some way God will use these stories and these lessons of wisdom that I am learning for your good, and for really like God using them in your life. So one of the things early on that I noticed was a way in which I said, God, these are things I want to do for you. These are ways in which I want to be used by you. And then I went after it. My entrepreneurial adventure, I did business coaching. I did all these different things to try to, get my business moving, to build lots of money and income. And I said they were about all sorts of things, like being able to send my parents on vacation, or being able to pay for things, or being able to give everybody really good Christmas presents, having extra, being able to use my money in ways that really gave and served people. And yet, underneath the surface, those things, while they're kind things, were still boiling down to my ego, my reputation, how people felt and thought about me, and the accolades and pats on the shoulder and thank yous and you're amazing. Those kinds of things were more important to me than really glorifying the Lord in all ways. The way that I found that out is by the things that mattered most to me as I went on the adventure of entrepreneurship. The things I invested in that I didn't belong investing in, the ways in which I used my resources, the ways in which I focused my time, the ways in which I listened to particular sorts of ears that did not have my spiritual best interest in mind, but wanted to use me like a pawn for monetary reasons, and me, myself, also using them as a pawn for feeling good about myself and getting lots of pats on the shoulder. You have potential. You're amazing. You're all these things. And the reason I want to share this with you is because it reminds me of a story that is becoming even dearer to my heart now more than ever, which is the story of Pilgrim's Progress. If you've not read this book, it's a little book. It's not that long. You must read it. It is an incredible story. And it's it's basically the story of the Christian life. This main character, Christian, who becomes a Christian, meets many different kinds of people and experiences many different kinds of things on his way to the celestial city, aka heaven, to be with the king, aka God. And the whole story is about Christian, but most importantly, it's about the ways in which God showed up for Christian to teach him more about himself, to teach him to trust in the king. And one of the things, there's many different characters that meet Christian along the way. And this one character in particular, named Watchful, meets Christian along his journey at a time where he really needs encouragement and a healthy dose of spiritual warning and discernment. And in a conversation with Watchful and Christian, this particular thing is said. They're talking about what are the biggest things ahead of you? What are the biggest things you need to be watching out for? And Watchful said the biggest danger is you, because you want to be king. And Christian looks at that response and he's like, what? Like, how can you say that? I don't want to be king. God is king. King is king. He is king, right? And Watchful says, oh, yes, you do. We all want to be king. And that is why you are the biggest, danger, essentially. You're the biggest danger to your journey to the celestial city. And that particular moment in the story has been the most influential this year so far, thinking about that element of the story, because I can look back at seasons of my life where I was, quote unquote, doing big things for the Lord. And yet it was sort of like good works was the wrapping to a gift that was really from Katie to Katie. And maybe that resonates for you in what you have chased, maybe what you are chasing. We can absolutely say, I'm doing these things for the Lord. But the real way that we know that for sure is to watch what matters most to us. So early on in my entrepreneurial adventure, I invested in a business coach that was Christian, quote unquote, and she was like, God wants you to be wealthy, healthy, and wise for him and for his works, and we're helping you get there, and blah, blah, blah. And it all sounded really good to me as a young, really, truly as a young Christian. And it spoke to my ego. It spoke to the part of me that Satan was winning in, which was that I could call something that I benefit from God's work. I could dub something that was really what I wanted as doing this for the Lord. And that was like a win-win, because I got my earthly desires and I also got perceived as a good heavenly citizen, And I think this is probably one of the biggest things that I observe currently in the world around me. The spiritual leaders, the big ones, there are many, many, many people that I have interacted with this year that sound very Christian. But when I look at their deeper theology, when I look at what they really believe and what their choices are, what they're saying when they're not really thinking about the fact that they're being filmed, or, what they're saying when they feel comfortable, what they're saying, how they're acting, what they're prioritizing, what they're investing in, what kind of advice are they giving. And I start to see some themes around, I'm going to shift and adjust what the Bible says, what proper doctrine is for my own gain. And I'm going to call it the Lord's work. Do I think all of these people are doing it intentionally? No. But even for me, like when I walked into, this is what I'm doing for the Lord, I'm going to run this business and it's going to be successful because God's going to make me successful. I was doing it in my mind. I'd convinced myself that this was for the Lord, but my actions and my behavior showed that I prioritized my own earthly gain, that this was more important to me than the Lord himself. I wanted to be king. I wanted to have power, fame, success, fortune, etc. I wanted to be king. And the reality is that part of us is always there. We always must be discerning and vigilant of, I want to be king. And if we aren't, if we say, well, I've changed, I'm not that way anymore. I used to be that way, but I'm not that way anymore. We miss the very lesson that God is trying to teach us, which is that to be wise, to be biblically wise, we must understand that we are not God, and that there is that fleshly desire in us to be him. And to be him in our own rules, in our own desires, in our own way of thinking about that, which is fallen and sinful and earthly and small, insignificant. And yet feels like that if we're not vigilant, that is what overpowers us. That is what drives our desires. And a lot of times that can look like a couple of things, and I'm going to name some of them off just to give you some ideas of what that may look like in your life. First and foremost, it can look like attachment. I need something to look a certain way. I'm not open to the fact that God could change it and that would be of him. I'm not willing to lose something that I really love because that's what God gave me. There's this attachment when we want what we want and it's really not about doing something for the Lord. There's also resentment and bitterness that comes in when things don't look the way we want them to look. There's that feeling of holding on to, which essentially says God didn't get the past right. So if he didn't get the past right, why would he have my present right? And why would he be someone to trust in of my future? Right? So the whole thing falls apart if I'm bitter of something that I think God missed in the past. And the reality is we're not going to understand everything that God does, but are we actually willing to allow wisdom to be built there, knowing that the first step of wisdom is understanding that I am not God. And the second step of wisdom is understanding who I need to get my answers from, who I need to be going for truth to, right? And both of those things must be held in the same level of weight and respect. I'm not God, and God is God, and he is who he says he is, and he's who I'm getting my answers from. And that's how we have that sanctification process. That's how we're actually getting the privilege of interacting in that sanctification process, of engaging, of being in an interactive relationship, a personal relationship with God as he grows us to be more and more like him. What a privilege, right? And that tangibly looks like grace and a willingness, a humility to understand I am not God and I trust him even when I don't know what he's doing. A willingness to respond in love even when someone else responds negatively to me. People who want their own gain don't really like it when they're mistreated. It feels unfair. You know, if someone stifles you out of, you know, if someone stifles you out of something or takes something from you, you feel like that's not fair. And the reality is that is what we are doing to God every day when we sin or turn our eyes or our focus or our worship away from him. And yet we don't like it when it's done to us. So that unforgiving heart is a part of whatever else we think is more important than God. Our reputation, how dare you, how could you, don't you know who I am, that sort of mentality. And a lot of that really gets built up as acceptable or understandable in a world where wealth, health, and fame, reputation, success are the things that are the ultimate. That's how you know that you're closer to God. This prosperity gospel sort of mentality. And the reality is that's not at all what the Bible says. The Bible communicates many of God's beloved servants were truly servants, and they lived like slaves. They lived poor, lowly, a lot of them in prison. There's only a few characters in the Bible that actually were like economically wealthy. And so it just goes to show that this lowly of heart, lowliness of life is often what follows. In some cases, there's an exception to that. It certainly does not mean that you cannot have a lot of money or a lot of, fame or reputation or authority and not be used profoundly by the Lord and be a devout believer in him. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But often there are, at minimum, seasons of our lives where a loneliness of heart also involves a lowliness of life and being willing to be there. Because the reality is, people who love the Lord and are close to the Lord, I think about David. I use David as an example often. He was very wealthy. He was the king. He was incredibly wealthy. He had lots of authority. He had anything he really wanted. He was a conqueror of many, many, many battles. And he was used by the Lord in profound ways. And he had his sin, and he had his particular vices that he gave himself over to. But one of the things that I think is very notable about David is that for most of his life, the riches and wealth that he could care less about. What he desired more than anything was a close relationship with the Lord. And you can see that in how he wrote the Psalms. He wanted God to search him, to know him, to see if there was any wicked way in him. Think about how gutsy that is. And that's profound. It's a beautiful example for us. And so it really comes down to like the material things that we want. They are things that can be used by the Lord, absolutely. But we have to be willing to be totally okay with those things not being in our life. This year has been a huge lesson for me around being willing for God to take everything that I love away from me and still be okay, to trust him even more, to not have the amazing job that I was looking for, to have that opportunity not work out, to have conversations and really prefer God to be glorified versus getting a really, really cool opportunity or a really cool open door, right? And that's distinctly different than living a life where I'm saying, well, this is for God, but my actions and my priorities reveal something different. And so I really want to encourage you to search your heart and to look at your behavior, your choices. What do you prioritize, and how does your life reveal that? And are you attached and stuck on, this is how God's going to use me and I'm not going to settle for anything else? Are you unwilling to allow the future plans that you've made to be changed because, well, this is from the Lord? Are you really totally trusting him? Are you willing to go anywhere that he's asking you to go? Have you actually thought about things being given up for the Lord? Are you okay with that? Are you willing to do that? Have you done that? These are all questions that we've got to ask, especially as young people in a very materialistic world. We've been brought up in a world where constantly culture is pushing at us that we deserve this, we deserve that. And the reality is we deserve hell. We deserve nothing good here on earth or in heaven. And when we come at life in that context, everything, every good thing, as small or meager as the world and the culture may see it as, those things are gifts from God. They are blessings that we do not deserve. And so when we come from that context, the wealth, fame, success sort of, pursuit really ends up being kind of silly. And that's how we know God is changing us from the inside out, giving us his wisdom, not the wisdom of the earth. And that is priceless. So I encourage you to take some time this week and really, as we really focused on Monday around our brand new series, so excited about it, New Girl, Same Name. We really looked at the vision of living bigger, living in a way that is eternally relevant. And as we start to get excited about the possibilities and the adventure that God has us on, we also in that same excitement must have a discernment to understand that there are going to be vices, there are going to be things that come alongside us that look like they're from God, but they're really our own desires and our own earthly pull. And we've got to be discerning enough to know that God is who he says he is, and we are not him. Both of those things need to be held in the same weight. So I encourage you to spend some time on that this week and really focus